Now, from the Signature Bank Studios.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We've been spending a lot of time on Tim Walz, but let us not forget about the principal here, Kamala.
Oh, yeah.
And we've been, for the last several weeks, playing some of her instant classics from our well-stocked Kamala vault. Here's one that hasn't gotten as much play as her explaining complicated things like cloud storage or artificial intelligence. But boy, is it telling. This is her talking about the power of a prosecutor. And listen to the way that she describes the power at her disposal back when she was a California Paul.
You know, the power I have as a prosecutor is that with a swipe of my pen, I can charge someone with a misdemeanor, the lowest level offense possible. And by virtue of that swipe of my pen, you will have to go to a courthouse and stand in line. You will have to come out of pocket and hire an attorney. You may get arrested for a few hours. You will be embarrassed in your community. You will miss time from coming onto the Google campus. All because with the swipe of my pen, I've charged you with a crime, which I may choose to dismiss 2 weeks later. It's an incredible amount of power.
Does that sound like someone you want to confer a great deal of political power to? Is that what you expect from a prosecutor, to be masturbatory about the political and legal power she has? It's just a wild way to describe herself as a prosecutor. And I mean, the way it comes across, I can indict anybody, I can release anybody, I can, jerk anybody around I want with just the swipe of my pen. It was like, it's like Obama with his phone and his pen, but as a prosecutor with my pen, it sounds like somebody who is high on the capriciousness of, high on the idea of exercising power in a capricious manner to inflict damage on people she doesn't like or to protect people she does. Boy, and it turns out that she's perfect for what the justice system at the federal level has become under this administration, isn't she? For more on all of this and Tim Walz, please be joined by John Hinderaker, president of the Center of the American Experiment and a contributor to PowerlineBlog.com as well. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, great to be with you, Dan.
I know, as a Minnesotan, you've got lots to say on Walz, but let's just pull back a little bit too and remind ourselves who Kamala Harris is, in addition to being sort of thinly abled intellectually. I mean, that sort of Soviet response about her prosecutorial power is I don't know, something that should be profiled a little bit more.
Dan, that clip that you just played was absolutely horrifying. In the legal world, what she described there is known as abusive discretion. She's openly saying that with a swipe of her pen, she can cause you all kinds of problems. She can embarrass you. She can cause you to be arrested. She can cost you money. And then she can just dismiss the case. I mean, that's really shocking.
All right. Well, let's get to your buddy Tim, who's joined this shocking former prosecutor. Obviously his record is being poured over right now, and the receipts are coming in fast and furious. But just the positioning, right? The positioning is the folksy teacher, football coach who can connect with rural and exurban voters the same way he did when he was a member of Congress in Minnesota. Is that still in Tim Walz's ability? Is that still part of his skill set?
Well, I think the Democrats are hoping it is, but I can tell you Tim Walz is deeply, deeply unpopular in rural Minnesota. When he ran for re-election in 2022, he was almost shut out among rural counties. And in fact, he is famous in Minnesota for the contempt he expresses for rural America. There's a video clip of him. He's talking to fellow Democrats. And he talks about the fact that some Democrats get worried because they look at the map and they see these huge swaths of red, across rural America. And Tim Walz says, well, you don't have to worry about that. That's mostly just rocks and cows in those areas.
I saw that. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And so a group of rural Minnesotans formed a group called Rocks and Cows of Minnesota. And they put up anti-Walz billboards. They sold merchandise. That's just a notorious incident in Minnesota. He's deeply, deeply unpopular on the countryside.
Well, he's a 60-year-old white Christian man who embraces, the illegals and the Muslim community. I mean, the squad loves him.
Well, the squad loves him, and they should. I mean, by embracing legals, let's clarify, too, we're talking about free college and free health care paid for by the taxpayers. No, he has done everything he can to encourage illegals to move to Minnesota, and I think that's partly because everybody else is moving out.
Hey, that rocks and cows, shouldn't it be rocks, cows, and fax machines for this ticket? Because remember, farmers don't have access to fax machines, so so voter ID laws would be unfair to them.
Yeah, I guess. And by the way, the other one I think you mentioned is the fact that he's a veteran. And I think here, too, the Democrats are thinking, oh, great, a veteran from the countryside. Well, that's sort of true. He did serve, I think, for 24 years in the Minnesota National Guard, and he rose to a high position in the National Guard. But then at the key moment, the Minnesota Guard was given orders to deploy to Iraq. And Tim Walz quit rather than be deployed. And a number of his fellow former National Guardsmen are bitterly angry at him to this day.
Yeah, we were just talking about that actually before you joined us. Tom Behrens, this interview that Tom Behrens gave to Alpha News in 2022 during that gubernatorial race, literally accusing Walz of stolen valor. Yeah, well, it's that too is a famous incident, and if the Democrats think that any veterans are going to be impressed by Tim Walz's military service, I'm pretty sure they're going to be disappointed. Well, you're a colleague of yours, or a fellow contributor of yours, Scott Johnson, who's a retired attorney up there, wrote this piece for the Journal about Tim Walz, and just summarizing what Minnesota has become under Walz, and hopefully the Republican Party can put some visuals to this characterization for the purposes of advertisements. Mr. Walz, under Mr. Walz, Minnesota has become a high crime state. Student achievement has tumbled. The spending on schools has skyrocketed. Per capita gross domestic product has fallen below the national average. And Minnesotans have joined residents of New York, California, and Illinois in fleeing their home state. I mean, we were talking about this bit earlier. It's very much like when you talk about big blue city mayors. Like if you put J.B. Pritzker in Minnesota and Tim Walz in Illinois, would anything change in either one of those states?
Well, nothing would change. As a matter of fact, J.B. Pritzker was the biggest contributor to the Democrats in the 2022 election cycle. He put in more than $4 million of his own money here in Minnesota. That's how much he likes Tim Walz. There are visuals for everything you just mentioned, Dan, and they were put together by my organization, Center of the American Experiment. And they're out there widely because they're incredibly effective. And what Scott recited in his piece in the Journal and what we've said over and over again is that on a policy level, Tim Walz has been a failure every bit as bad as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been in Washington. And you just ticked off the main areas, and we've published charts that show all these things graphically. Minnesota's always been a low-crime state, always. Well, for the first time in our history, largely as a result of what Tim Walz did and didn't do during the George Floyd riots, Minnesota is now officially a high-crime state, and we've remained since 2020 a high-crime state relative to the rest of the country. Student achievement has plummeted, even as spending on our public schools has skyrocketed. And Dan, this is shocking, but more than half of all of the public school kids in Minnesota can neither read nor do math at grade level. More than half. I mean, it's just absolutely shocking. Minnesota's always been a relatively high-income state until Tim Walz came along. Not anymore. Last year, for the first time ever, Minnesota's gross domestic product per capita is below the national average. Never happened before. And as a result of all this, Minnesota has become just like California, just like Illinois, just like New York. People are fleeing the state as fast as their cars can drive across the state
Jonathan,
line.
I don't know if you heard them yesterday. Tim Walz blamed the high crime on President Trump. Okay,
that's a great theory, Timmy, but I mean that does not explain why we used to be below average in serious crimes, and now we are above average compared to the country which Trump was the president of in serious crimes. Tim Walz froze during the George Floyd riots in 2020, and for 4 days he refused to call out the National Guard, despite countless people pleading with him to do that. He refused, and he said he refused because he was sympathetic to the rioters' cause. And as a result of his freezing up during the George Floyd riots, big chunks of the city of Minneapolis and some other cities around Minnesota were destroyed by arsonists. And Donald Trump had absolutely nothing to do with that.
You know, I wanted to get your reaction to a snippet from Walz's appearance at that rally in Philadelphia yesterday. Everybody's going to focus on the couch joke and Shapiro and stuff, but the way he characterized J.D. Vance was really striking to me, and I wonder if you think this works in Minneapolis or anywhere else for that matter. Take a listen.
J.D. Vance literally wrote the foreword for the architect of the Project 2025 agenda. Like all regular people I grew up with in the heartland, J.D. studied at Yale, had his career funded by Silicon Valley billionaires, and then wrote a bestseller trashing that community. Come on! That's not what middle America is. And I got to tell you, I can't wait to debate the guy.
I can't wait for him to debate the guy either. But I mean, J.D. Vance overcoming growing up poor in Appalachia in a family suffering from addiction issues and making his way to Yale Law School and then success in business and to the United States Senate and writing a bestseller and having it optioned into a Hollywood movie. That's something to ridicule.
Sounds like the American dream to me. But, you know, Tim Walz is a vicious, mean-spirited person, and that came through in that clip. You know, he is really not a nice man. The other thing I got to tell you, he says he's anxious to debate J.D. Vance. In his 2022 campaign, he debated the Republican candidate exactly once at Farm Fest in southern Minnesota, and he got clobbered. After that, he refused to show up for any future debates, even though they were scheduled by local news organizations. So the Republican candidate for governor would debate, i.e. be interviewed by reporters, next to an empty chair where Tim Walz refused to show up. So he does not have any kind of a history as a strong debater.
Before we let you go, I did want to get your view on one other topic, give you an opportunity. Remembering Cori Bush, we lost another socialist Spice Girl last night, and you know, your favorite Cori Bush moment as we recall her service in Congress.
Oh gosh, let me say this, Dan. I can't even pick one out. I mean, I have mixed feelings about these squad members, losing in primaries. The thing I liked about them is that they said what they actually thought, and they came out as open anti-Semites. Now we know that wing of the Democratic Party is very strong, which is why Josh Shapiro is not on the national ticket. But I think it's in some ways it was good to have people in that party who would actually come out and say what they thought.
That's a good point. John Hinderaker, President and Center of the American Experiment, contributor to PowerlineBlog.com. John, thank you as always.
Thank you, Dan. Bye-bye.
Man, he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Oil investments involve a high degree of risk and actual results may vary.
The price of gas and oil remains strong, and Goldman Sachs predicts the growth in demand to keep growing for years to come. Get in on the next major oil boom now and help the